Hey folks, this is Akshay Dhave and welcome back to another video on our series in estimation. Now, today we're going to talk a little bit about what to consider while sizing a story and what not to consider while sizing a story. Now, when you generally give a size, or more traditionally it's called an estimate, and that in itself is a little bit of a problem. But the natural question that comes to your mind when you think about story size is how long will I take to finish the story? And so you start thinking about different types of parameters, right? You start thinking about what is the story, how complex is the UX or the algorithm that I'm writing for this story. How many application layers am I going to affect? Is it just a UI enhancement or something that I'm going to do on the front end, or am I changing everything from the database to the service layer to the front end? And that might affect how big the task is, how complex it is. You might also want to take into consideration the impact of the changes. So let's say that you're changing this that database schema itself, or you're changing some contracts. Then that means that there's going to be some additional testing. There might be some data migration to do. So those are things that you would need to consider. And you might also want to consider what kind of refactoring do you need to do before you can actually build this feature. So your code might not be in the right shape for you to build this new feature that you're talking about, that's explained in the story. And so before you start building that feature, you might have to tweak your code base a little bit. And this is called refactoring, that we would do in the wake of a functional story that you're playing. So you might have to take into consideration all of these parameters. And these roughly fall in the complexity bucket. Now there is another bucket called expertise, right? You would think, have we done this as a team, this kind of work? If you've done one kind of integration multiple times in the past, and the next story is of a similar type of integration, then you would take that into consideration when you think about uh, size. You would also naturally start thinking about, am I good at this? Have I done it before? Because someone is asking you the question, you are giving the size, and so you're likely to think about yourself in that equation. um, you might also think, do we have expertise on the team, even if I'm not an expert and the team hasn't done before, but do we have access to that expertise? Is there someone on the team who has done this, so that we can benefit from that? You might consider dependencies. For example, you might have to wait for environments or some infrastructure to be available to you to play this story. You might need some paid licenses, some library, or approvals for that. You might just be dependent on something that another team is going to do before you can do your work. So those are dependencies. And then there might be just obstacles, like you don't have access to the right information, or you don't have access to the right data. Sometimes we don't have access to production data, for example, and that might be a obstacle for you. Or people who actually have this information or have the answer are not available, or someone falls sick while they're in the while they're executing. You might have shared environments as a team, and so I've seen the scenario where you have to wait for that environment to be available before you can put your code on it. So when you're dependent on the environment to be available, you have asked for a new environment or something, but this is a shared environment that everybody uses for testing, and so you have to do your work, but you can't test it unless everybody pushes to the same environment at the same time, and so there might be complications like that in your organization. So it is likely that you will take all of these things into consideration. But what we need to understand is, when we are sizing a story, we are not trying to answer this question of how long will I take to finish the story. Instead, we are trying to answer the question, how big is this story compared to other stories in the backlog? And that is the biggest thing that you have to learn about story sizing. Because if you try to answer this question, you will end up with all the problems that we had with time based estimates. And so if this is how you're doing story sizing, you might as well just do time-based estimates. So what you have to keep in mind is, if you want to do story sizing properly, then you should be only thinking about this question, which is, how big is this story compared to other stories in the backlog? So even when we are asking this question about how big is the story, it's not an absolute number. It's not like a function point analysis that we're trying to do. We're just talking about how big is the story in comparison to other stories that we've seen or other stories in the backlog. And so if you look back at all the things that we discussed, the only section that actually matters is the complexity section, right? So how complex is the UX design or the UI enhancement that I have to do, or how complex is the algorithm that I'm coding here? What kind of application layers are affected? Am I making changes to database schemas? Will it require data migration? What kind of refactoring is required before I can even start on this story? Those are the kind of things that you would think of in the complexity bucket, and there might be a few others as well. This is not an exhaustive list, but that is the only thing that you should consider when you're actually sizing a story. And so what happens to all these other parameters? They are also important. They can't be ignored. They are all real things that affect how long something will take, and that's right, but they are not part of the story size. They are part of how fast can we do this story. So all of these other parameters should reflect in your velocity. So it might be the same 2-point story that you're doing. You're creating, let's say, a login page with all the way down to the database layer. So you're building up a complete new login authentication mechanism for your application, and let's say that you've sized it as 2 points. Now, whether you've done this before, whether you have all the dependencies met already, whether you have all the licenses, all the environments that you need, whether you're being stopped by any of these obstacles, all of those things will affect how fast you can finish that login story. But the story itself is just the complexity, and that is the main thing that you have to keep in mind when you size the story. Thank you so much, and see you in the next one.